Some weddings are built on love. This one is built on the ashes of the past. Can a pureblood prince choose a heart over a name when the price of freedom is everything he owns? Our story is unfolding right at this moment. The air in the Malfoy Manor drawing room was perpetually cold, a lingering frost that no amount of wandless warmth or enchanted hearths could truly thaw. Draco Malfoy stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his fingers tracing the silver signet ring on his left hand. Outside, the Wiltshire grounds were draped in a suffocating grey mist, mirroring the velvet constriction in his chest. In exactly 3 months, this house, this mausoleum of his childhood, would host the wedding of the century. He was to marry Pansy Parkinson. It was the sensible choice, the pure-blood choice, the only choice left for a man whose name was still whispered with a mixture of pity and disdain in the darker corners of the ministry. The representative from Golden Griffin is here, Draco. His mother's voice drifted from the doorway, thin and elegant, like fine porcelain that had been glued back together. Do try to look presentable. This wedding is the only thing keeping the Malfoy name in the social register. Draco didn't turn. He merely tightened his grip on his cane. I am always presentable, Mother. It is the only thing I have left. He heard the soft click of heels against the marble. Narcissa had already retreated, leaving him to face the magical architect who would design the stage for his lifelong imprisonment. He expected a fawning ministry sycophant, or perhaps a boutique designer from Paris, who would tremble at the sight of his dark mark. He did not expect the sharp, rhythmic tap of sensible dragon-hide boots. He did not expect the scent of parchment, sandalwood, and something frustratingly like rain-washed grass. Mr. Malfoy, I believe we have a schedule to keep. Draco froze. That voice. It was a voice that had haunted his fever dreams during the war, sometimes shrieking in pain, sometimes lecturing him on the proper stirring of a draught of living death. He turned slowly, his mask of aristocratic boredom firmly in place, though his heart suffered a sudden, violent lurch against his ribs. Hermione Granger stood in the centre of the drawing room. She looked devastatingly professional. Her wild curls were tamed into a sophisticated knot at the nape of her neck, though a few stubborn strands defied her authority. She held a clipboard of enchanted vellum, and her eyes, those amber, piercing eyes, met his without a flicker of fear. There was only a cold, clinical detachment that grated on his nerves more than hatred ever could. Granger, he breathed, the name tasting like copper and old memories. I was told the firm was sending their best. I didn't realize the Golden Girl had been reduced to picking out table linens for her former enemies. Hermione didn't flinch. She stepped forward, the heels of her boots echoing in the vast, silent space. I am the CEO of Golden Griffin, Draco. I don't pick linens, I curate legacies. And since your family is currently a social pariah, your mother felt that only my impeccable reputation could convince the Wizengamot that this wedding isn't a gathering of Death Eaters in disguise. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough for him to see the faint shadow of a scar on her neck peeking from her collar. His stomach turned. The internal monologue he had spent years perfecting, the one where he was the victim of circumstance, shattered. Is this a joke? Draco asked, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. "You, in this house? After everything?" "I am a professional," she said, though he noticed her fingers tighten slightly on her clipboard. "I am here to ensure that when you say your vows to Pansy Parkinson, the world sees a reformed Malfoy, not a retreating one. Now, shall we discuss the ballroom? Or do you intend to spend the next hour leaning against that window, looking like a tragic hero in a cheap novel?" Draco felt the familiar heat of irritation rise in his throat, a welcome distraction from the hollow ache of guilt. She was still insufferable, still bossy, still so damnably Granger. "The ballroom is through the east wing," he snapped, pushing past her. As he did, his shoulder brushed hers. It was the briefest of contacts, a mere whisper of fabric, but it felt like a static shock. He saw her breath hitch, a microscopic crack in her armor, and for a fleeting second, the enemy was gone, replaced by the girl he had watched from across a library for 7 years. They walked in a tense, heavy silence through the corridors. Draco found himself watching her out of the corner of his eye. She was assessing the architecture, her quills scratching frantically against the vellum, but he noticed how she avoided looking at the shadows in the corners. She was brave, yes, but even Hermione Granger wasn't immune to the ghosts of this place. "The theme is eternal luminescence," Draco said, his voice echoing. "Pansy wants 10,000 floating candles. She wants the Malfoy emeralds integrated into the floral arrangements. She wants it to be grand. She wants it to be loud," Hermione corrected, stopping in the center of the great ballroom. She looked up at the darkened chandeliers. "She wants it to drown out the silence of this house. But candles won't do that, Draco. You need light that actually reaches the corners. And I suppose you have the golden solution," he sneered, though the bite was missing from his tone. Hermione turned to face him. The late afternoon sun filtered through the high windows, catching the amber in her eyes, turning them into molten honey. For a moment, the vast space between them, the blood, the war, the prejudices, seemed to vibrate with a different kind of energy. "I have a vision," she said softly. "But it requires you to be honest with me. This wedding, it's a contract, isn't it?" Draco's mask slipped. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to tell her the truth, to tell her that every night he felt like he was drowning, that the thought of Pansy's hand in his made his skin crawl with a sense of finality that felt like a death sentence. "It is my duty," he said, his voice stiff. "Something you wouldn't understand, being so unburdened by history." Hermione's expression shifted. The clinical coldness returned, sharper than before. "Unburdened? You think I don't carry history? I carry the marks of this very floor on my back, Malfoy. Don't talk to me about duty." She turned away, her quill flying across the page. "I will send the initial drafts by owl tomorrow. I expect your feedback by noon. And Draco." He didn't answer, but he watched her. "Try not to look so much like a man walking to the gallows. It ruins the aesthetic." She swept out of the room, her robes billowing behind her. Draco stood alone in the center of the ballroom, the silence of the manor crashing back down on him like a physical weight. He looked down at his hand, the hand that would soon wear a wedding band, and realized he was shaking. Am I really in love with a mudblood? The thought struck him like a curse. It was sudden, violent, and utterly terrifying. He hadn't even realized he was thinking it. He tried to shove it down, to bury it under centuries of pure-blood pride and the memory of his father's voice. But the scent of sandalwood stayed in the air, and for the first time in years, the Malfoy Manor didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a cage. And the only person who held the key was the one woman he was supposed to despise. The following week was a blur of high-tension meetings and the stifling fragrance of enchanted lilies. Hermione returned to the manor every afternoon, her presence a jarring contrast to the stagnant, dark history of the Malfoy estate. She brought with her a whirlwind of colour, vibrant parchment, shimmering fabric swatches, and a relentless, clinical energy that Draco found both infuriating and intoxicating. He watched her from the shadows of the library doorway as she directed a team of decorators, her wand movements fluid and precise. She was a conductor of light, and he was a creature of the dark, merely observing the sun. "The seating chart, Draco," she said, without looking up, her voice echoing off the mahogany shelves. "I've moved the knots away from the green grasses. We don't want a blood feud breaking out over the appetizers." Draco stepped into the light, his hands shoved deep into his trouser pockets. "My mother will have an aneurysm if the sacred 28 aren't grouped by lineage, Granger. You're playing with fire." Hermione finally turned, brushing a stray curl from her forehead with the back of her hand. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the hearth. "I'm playing with logistics. If this wedding is meant to signal a new era, as your mother claims, then we cannot seat people based on how many centuries their ancestors spent marrying their own cousins." Draco winced, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth despite himself. "Cruel, Granger. Accurately so, but cruel." "I'm practical," she countered, stepping closer to him. She held out a piece of enchanted vellum that shimmered with moving golden ink. "Look at this. I've designed a layout that flows from the center, the couple, outward in concentric circles of influence. It's modern. It's inclusive." Draco looked down, but he didn't look at the map. He looked at her fingers, stained with ink, holding the parchment with a steady strength he envied. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing, so intense it made his lungs seize. He wanted to reach out and touch the pulse point at her wrist, to see if her heart raced as fast as his did when they were this close. Instead, he forced his gaze to the ink. "Pansy will hate it," he murmured. "She wants a dais. She wants to look down on everyone." "And what do you want, Draco?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unadorned. It was the first time she had used his first name without a sneer or a professional bite. He looked up, meeting her gaze. The amber in her eyes was soft now, inquisitive, stripped of the defensive armor she usually wore. "I want to be able to breathe," he confessed, the words slipping out before he could catch them. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths. For a moment, the war was gone. The blood status didn't matter. There was only a man who felt like a ghost and a woman who was too full of life for him to handle. He saw her eyes soften, a flicker of something. Was it pity or understanding, crossing her face? She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from his forearm. "Draco! The flowers!" The doors swung open, and Pansy Parkinson swept in, a cloud of expensive French perfume and sharp edges. She didn't look at Hermione. She looked at Draco, her eyes narrowing as she took in their proximity. Draco, darling, the peonies are the wrong shade of blush. They look almost common, Pansy said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She walked over and looped her arm through Draco's, pulling him away. And really, why are we huddled in this dusty library? Miss Granger, I pay you to create a fairy tale, not to bore my fiancé with paperwork. Draco felt the warmth of the moment vanish, replaced by a cold, familiar resentment. He didn't pull away from Pansy, but he felt like he was being strangled by her silk-clad arm. He looked back at Hermione. Her expression had shuttered instantly. The professional mask was back, colder and harder than the marble floors. "My apologies, Miss Parkinson," Hermione said, her voice clipped. "I was merely ensuring the fairy tale has a functional foundation. I'll leave you to your flowers." She gathered her things with jerky, agitated movements. As she passed Draco, she didn't look at him. She didn't have to. The air she left behind was cold, and the sudden absence of her scent felt like a physical blow. "She's so transactional, isn't she?" Pansy remarked, inspecting her manicure. "I suppose that's what happens when you have no breeding, no sense of the soul of a house." Draco looked at the woman he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with. He saw the shallowness, the vanity, the echo of his father's worst traits. Then he looked at the empty space where Hermione had stood. She had more soul in her ink-stained thumb than this entire house had seen in a century. "She is the brightest witch of her age, Pansy," Draco said, his voice dangerously low. "Try to remember that when you speak of her breeding." Pansy laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Oh, Draco, don't tell me you've developed a conscience for the help. It's unbecoming." That night, Draco couldn't sleep. He paced the drawing room, the very room where he had watched his aunt carve words into Hermione's skin. The guilt he had suppressed for years began to bleed through the cracks in his resolve. He looked at the floor, almost expecting to see the stains of her blood. He realized then that his internal dialogue had changed. It was no longer a question of if he was in love with her, but how he had ever imagined he wasn't. The Mudblood slur felt like a poison in his mouth, a lie he had been fed since birth that was now rotting his insides. He walked to the desk where Hermione had left a spare roll of parchment. He picked it up, smelling the faint scent of sandalwood. He was a Malfoy. He was a coward. He was engaged. And he was utterly, hopelessly lost in a woman who should have been his greatest enemy. The next morning, the manor felt different. The tension had shifted from a simmer to a boil. When Hermione arrived for their scheduled site visit to the gardens, she was accompanied by a ministry official, a safeguard, she claimed, for the historical preservation of the Malfoy grounds. Draco met them at the terrace. He looked at Hermione, searching for a sign of the softness from the library, but she was a fortress. She spoke only to the official, her back to Draco as they walked through the rose gardens. "The reception will be held under a canopy of starlight charms," she explained, her voice professional and distant. "We will need to neutralize the dark magic lingering in the soil here to ensure the charms don't flicker." "Neutralize it?" Draco asked, stepping forward. "That soil has been enchanted for 400 years. And for the last 20, it has been fed on hate," Hermione said, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were hard. "I cannot build something beautiful on a foundation of rot, Mr. Malfoy. Either the dark magic goes, or the wedding will be as cold as the people attending it. The ministry official shifted uncomfortably. Now, Miss Granger, let's not get political. It's not political, she snapped. It's a matter of light and dark. You can't have both in the same space. She looked directly at Draco then, and he knew she wasn't just talking about the soil. She was talking about him. She was waiting for him to choose, to be the man who sat in the library and confessed he couldn't breathe, or the man who stood by and let the world call her the help. "Clear the soil," Draco said, his voice steady. Hermione blinked, surprised by his quick capitulation. "Draco," the official asked, "your father will—" "My father is in a cell in Azkaban," Draco interrupted. "I am the master of this house. Clear the soil. Remove the darkness. Do whatever Miss Granger deems necessary." For a heartbeat, the frost between them cracked. Hermione's lips parted, a small, genuine look of shock crossing her features. But then, a dark owl descended from the sky, carrying a letter with the Parkinson seal. Hermione watched as Draco took the letter, her expression turning to one of bitter realization. The seesaw swung back. The warmth vanished. She was reminded, once again, that no matter how much light he allowed her to bring into his garden, he was still bound to the dark by a golden ring. "I'll leave you to your correspondence," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We have a lot of work to do if we're to make this place look like a home." As she walked away, Draco ripped the letter open without looking at it. He didn't care what Pansy wanted. He only cared about the way Hermione's shoulders slumped as she retreated. He had defended her, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough as long as he was walking toward a different altar. He looked at the garden, at the patches of dead earth she wanted to heal. He felt like one of those patches, dark, withered, and waiting for a miracle he didn't deserve. The dust motes danced in the singular shaft of light that pierced the gloom of the manor's north gallery. It was a corridor rarely used, lined with portraits of Malfoy ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow Hermione with a collective, silent snarl. Draco walked a pace behind her, his footsteps heavy. He watched the way her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted the strap of her beaded bag. She was here to inspect the lighting for the gallery walk, the path the guests would take toward the grand ballroom. But the air in this wing was different. It was stagnant, smelling of old wax and the sharp, metallic tang of ancient magic that refused to die. "We need to replace these sconces," Hermione said, her voice sounding thin in the vaulted space. She didn't look at him. She hadn't looked at him directly since the encounter in the garden. The green flame is too reminiscent of the old regime. We need something warmer. Floating lanterns, perhaps. "The sconces are goblin-wrought, Granger," Draco replied, his voice a low rasp. "My great-grandfather spent a fortune on them. To remove them would be seen as an insult to the lineage." "Everything in this house is an insult to someone, Draco," she snapped, finally spinning around. Her eyes were bright with a sudden, fierce spark of anger. "The tapestries, the portraits, the very stones. I am trying to make this place habitable for people who don't have Malfoy as a surname. If you want a museum of pure-blood supremacy, hire a curator. If you want a wedding, let me do my job." Draco stepped into her personal space, the proximity sudden and jarring. He could see the pulse jumping in her throat. Is that what this is? Just a job? You walk through these halls with your chin up and your clipboard out, acting as if you didn't scream my name in the room just 3 doors down. The silence that followed was deafening. The air between them turned electric, a physical pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. Hermione's face went pale, then a deep, burning crimson. The room was the drawing room, the memory of the war, of Bellatrix, the knife, and Draco's own paralyzed terror rose up between them like a physical wall of ice. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice shaking with a rage so cold it felt like a frostbite. "How dare you bring that up as if it's a casual point of debate?" "I bring it up because it's the only thing in this house that is real," Draco shouted, his composure finally shattering. The mask he had worn for weeks, the mask of the dutiful fiancé, the reformed aristocrat, cracked down the middle. "You act as if we can just paint over the cracks, Granger. You want to put up floating lanterns and change the flowers, but you won't look at me. You won't even look at the floor because you're afraid you'll see yourself there." He took another step, his chest nearly brushing hers. "I think about it every night. I think about the way I didn't move. I think about the way you looked at me, begging for help. And I did nothing." Hermione's breath came in ragged gasps. Her eyes searched his, looking for the lie, but she found only the raw, bleeding guilt of a man who had been hollowed out by his own cowardice. The enemy's dynamic was failing them. It was being replaced by something far more dangerous, shared trauma. "You were a boy, Draco," she said, her voice softening into something agonizingly tender. "We were all children caught in a monster's game. I wasn't a child. I was a Malfoy. I was supposed to be better." He reached out, his fingers ghosting near her temple, not quite touching her skin. The tension was no longer one of hatred, but of a desperate, forbidden gravity. "And now, I'm marrying a woman who laughs at your scars. Tell me, Granger, how is that for a fairy tale?" For a moment, the world narrowed down to the space between them. Hermione didn't pull away. She leaned into the heat of his hand, her eyes fluttering shut. It was a surrender, a brief white flag in a war that had lasted a decade. Draco felt the magnetic pull of her, the urge to close the distance and press his mouth to hers, to apologize in the only way he knew how, by losing himself in her. But the manor had a way of reclaiming its own. A sharp, rhythmic clicking echoed from the far end of the gallery. Lucius Malfoy, his gait stiff, but his presence as commanding as ever, emerged from the shadows. His cane tapped against the stone like a ticking clock. "Draco," his father's voice drawled, cold and precise. "I wasn't aware the wedding planner required such personal supervision." The spell broke. Hermione recoiled as if she had been burned, her face snapping back into a mask of professional indifference. Draco felt the cold air rush into the space she had occupied, a void that felt like a physical wound. He straightened his shoulders, his expression turning to stone. "We were discussing the lighting, Father," Draco said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Miss Granger was suggesting lanterns." Lucius stopped a few feet away, his silver-blue eyes raking over Hermione with a disdain that made Draco's blood boil. "Lanterns? How very whimsical. I'm sure the Parkinsons will appreciate such a light touch. However, Draco, your mother is waiting in the conservatory. There is a matter regarding the dowry that requires your signature. A Malfoy doesn't keep his bride waiting." Lucius turned his gaze to Hermione, a predatory glint in his eyes. "I trust you find our history educational, Miss Granger. It would be a shame for someone of your background to miss the nuances of such an ancient house." "I find it exactly as I expected, Mr. Malfoy," Hermione replied, her voice steady and hard as diamonds, full of shadows that are afraid of the sun. She didn't wait for a dismissal. She turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high, leaving Draco standing between the ghost of his past and the misery of his future. "She is a tool, Draco," Lucius said, stepping closer to his son once Hermione was out of earshot. "A means to an end. Do not forget that the dirt under our boots is more valuable than her blood. You will marry Pansy. You will restore this house. And you will stop looking at that girl as if she is anything more than the help we are forced to endure." Draco didn't look at his father. He looked at the doorway where Hermione had disappeared. He felt the weight of the Malfoy ring on his finger, a ring that felt like a shackle. Am I really in love with a mudblood? The question wasn't a curse anymore. It was a confession. That evening, the first betrayal arrived. A package was delivered to Hermione's office in Diagon Alley, sent by the Malfoy estate. Inside was a formal letter, signed by Draco, stating that all her proposed changes to the North Gallery and the drawing room had been rejected. The letter was cold, dismissive, and explicitly cited the preservation of pureblood heritage as the reason. It was a lie, a document forced upon him by Lucius and the threat of a complete social collapse. But Hermione didn't know that. All she saw was the man who had almost touched her in the hallway, now hiding behind his father's quill. In the manor, Draco sat alone in the dark, staring at a glass of fire whiskey. He had signed the paper to protect her from his father's increasing vitriol, thinking that pushing her away was the only way to keep her safe. But as he watched the rain lash against the window, he realized he hadn't just pushed her away. He had confirmed every terrible thing she had ever thought about him. The seesaw had plunged into the depths of doubt. The warmth of the gallery was gone, replaced by a bitter, biting cold. Draco realized that in trying to save his name, he was losing the only thing that made him want to stay alive. And the wedding was only 2 months away. The rain in the forest of Dean did not fall. It drifted in heavy, ethereal curtains of silver, blurring the lines between the ancient oaks and the darkening sky. Hermione stood at the edge of a clearing, her cloak dampened, staring at the site of the proposed pre-wedding gala location. It was a secluded glen, chosen for its rare magical resonance, but today it felt like a graveyard. Behind her, the soft crack of apparition announced his arrival. She didn't turn. The betrayal of the previous week, the cold, formal letter rejecting her designs, sat like a shard of ice in her chest. She had spent 3 days convinced she would resign, only to realize that leaving would mean letting him win. It would mean letting the Malfoy shadow extinguish the light she had fought so hard to bring into her professional life. "The ministry official is delayed," Draco said, his voice sounding raw against the rhythmic patter of the rain. "It's just us for the scouting." "Then let's make it quick, mister." "Malfoy," she replied, her voice as sharp as a splinter. "I have a business to run, and I've already wasted enough time on heritage preservation that leads nowhere." Draco flinched. He stepped forward, the dead leaves crunching under his boots. He looked worse than she did. His eyes were shadowed, his cheekbones sharper, and the hand holding his wand was pale to the point of translucence. "Granger, about the letter." "I don't care about the letter," she lied, finally spinning to face him. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her mouth, and she brushed it away with a violent motion. "I care about the cowardice. I care that you look me in the eye and talk about breathing, then hide behind your father's seal the moment the air gets thin. Did you think I wouldn't notice the change in tone, or did you just assume I'd be grateful for the billable hours?" "I had to," he hissed, moving into the clearing. The rain began to pick up, a sudden downpour that soaked through their layers in seconds. "You don't understand the pressure, Hermione. My father, he's looking for any reason to intervene. If I let you strip the manor of its history, he won't just fire you. He'll make sure you never work in London again. He'll make your life a misery." "My life has been a misery because of people like him for years," she shouted over the rising wind. "I am not a girl who needs protecting, Draco. I am the woman who helped end the war while you were busy shaking in your boots." The repulsion was physical now. She turned to walk away, but the mud was slick and her foot caught on a gnarled root. She stumbled, a gasp escaping her lips, and before she could hit the ground, Draco's arms were around her. He caught her with a strength that surprised her, pulling her flush against his chest. For a heartbeat, the anger vanished, replaced by the sheer, terrifying heat of their bodies colliding. The rain poured down on them, drenching their hair and clothes, but neither moved. Hermione's hands were pressed against his damp coat, feeling the frantic, uneven thud of his heart. "Let go," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. "I can't," he groaned, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "I can't let go, and I can't hold on. I'm being torn apart, Hermione. Every time I see you, I remember who I could have been if I hadn't been born a Malfoy. And every time I look at Pansy, I see the grave I've dug for myself." He pulled back just enough to look at her. His eyes were no longer silver. They were the colour of a storm-tossed sea. "I didn't write that letter because I agreed with it. I wrote it because I'm a coward who is terrified of losing the only thing I have left, this path to redemption. But I realized there is no redemption in a lie." The trust began to knit itself back together in the silence of the forest. Hermione looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the emotionally broken man beneath the tailored wool. He wasn't just grey, he was fading. "Why are you doing this, Draco?" she asked, her voice trembling with the cold and the intensity of the moment. "Why marry her? You don't love her. She doesn't even see you." "Because it's the script," he said, his grip on her waist tightening. "Because if I don't, I'm nothing. I'm just a traitor with a marked arm and a disgraced name." "You could be more," she whispered. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and brushed a wet lock of hair from his brow. The touch was electric. Draco let out a shuddering breath, his eyes fluttering shut as he leaned into her palm. In this wild, unkempt forest, away from the portraits and the expectations, the Mudblood and the prince were just two souls seeking warmth in a deluge. "I think of you," he confessed, his voice a low rumble that she felt in her very bones. "In the middle of the night, when the manor is too quiet, I think of the way you bite your lip when you're calculating. I think of the way you refuse to back down. I think I think I've been in love with you since the 3rd year, and I've spent every day since trying to hate you for it." Hermione felt the air leave her lungs. The can't help but think dynamic had finally been spoken into existence. It was no longer a ghost. It was a living, breathing thing between them. "Draco," she breathed, her heart racing. He leaned in, his lips inches from hers, the scent of rain and ozone thick in the air. The tension was unbearable, a bowstring stretched to the breaking point. He wanted to kiss her. She could see it in the desperate hunger of his gaze. But he stopped. The enemies to lovers seesaw tilted once more toward the internal conflict. "I can't," he rasped, his voice breaking. "Not while I'm still promised to another. I won't make you a mistress to a Malfoy. You deserve better than the scraps of a broken man." He released her suddenly, stepping back into the rain. The loss of his warmth was like a physical blow. Hermione stood in the mud, her breath hitching in her chest, watching him retreat into the professional mask. "The sight is unsuitable," he said, his voice regaining its cold aristocratic edge, though his hands were shaking. "The magical resonance is too unstable. Tell the Ministry we'll find somewhere else." He didn't wait for her response. He disapparated with a sharp crack, leaving Hermione alone in the pouring rain. She stood there for a long time, her hand pressed to her heart, wondering if the happy ending he was so afraid of was even possible. The seesaw had shifted. She no longer doubted his feelings, but she doubted his strength. And as the wedding date loomed closer, a giant golden clock ticking toward his doom, she realized that she wasn't just planning a wedding anymore. She was planning an escape. But for an escape to work, the prisoner has to want to leave. She walked back toward the apparition point, the word Mudblood echoing in her mind. He had called her Hermione. He had admitted his love. But as she looked at her own hand, the hand of a girl who had worked for everything she had, she wondered if a Malfoy would ever truly be brave enough to stand beside her in the light. The chapter ended, not with a resolution, but with a question that burned hotter than any fire. She needed to know what he would do when the ring was in his hand and the vows were on his tongue. She needed to know if he was truly hers, or if he was just another ghost haunting the Forest of Dean. The dining room of Malfoy Manor was a cavern of suffocating elegance, draped in emerald silk and lit by 1,000 enchanted candles that refused to flicker. This was the final tasting, the last hurdle before the wedding of the century. Draco sat at the head of the long table, his father to his right, Pansy to his left. Across from them, looking like a lioness in a den of vipers, sat Hermione. She was surrounded by silver platters and crystal decanters, her quill moving with a cold, rhythmic precision that made Draco's nerves fray like old rope. "The pheasant is adequate," Lucius drawled, his silver fork clinking against the porcelain with the finality of a gavel. "But the wine, Miss Granger, it's a bit New World, isn't it? One would think a woman of your supposed intelligence would understand that a Malfoy cellar does not tolerate anything less than a 1945 Bordeaux." Hermione didn't look up from her notes. "The selection was made to complement the lighter palate of the younger guests, Mr. Malfoy. However, if you prefer the taste of dust and stagnant tradition, I can certainly adjust the order." Pansy let out a sharp, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Draco, listen to her. She's so defensive of her little choices. It's almost adorable, like a house elf trying to dress itself in its master's clothes. Draco felt the fire whiskey he'd been nursing turn to acid in his stomach. He looked at Hermione. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her quill, but her face was a mask of granite. She was taking it. For the sake of her professional reputation, for the sake of the contract, she was letting these people bleed her with words. The approach of the forest had been replaced by a brutal repulsion. "Pansy, that's enough," Draco said, his voice low and dangerous. "Is it?" Pansy turned her sharp gaze to him, her eyes glittering with a suspicion that had been festering for weeks. "You've been very quiet lately, Draco. Very distant. Ever since you started spending all those scouting hours with our dear planner. One might wonder if you've forgotten which side of the table you belong on." "I know exactly where I belong," Draco hissed, his hand clenching under the table. Lucius leaned forward, the candlelight catching the cruel lines around his mouth. "Do you, my son? Because there are rumors, whispers that you've been seen in the company of, let us call them, unsuitable influences. I would hate for the Parkinson alliance to be tarnished by a momentary lapse in judgment, especially with someone who has no more place in this world than the mud on our boots." The slur hung in the air, thick and foul. Hermione's quill finally stopped. She looked up, her amber eyes meeting Lucius's with a defiance that was nothing short of suicidal. "My blood may not be sacred, Mr. Malfoy," she said, her voice vibrating with a suppressed power that made the candles flare. "But it is mine. It isn't a debt I'm paying back to ancestors who are long dead and forgotten. Can your son say the same?" "Granger, stop," Draco warned. But it wasn't a threat. It was a plea. He saw the trap closing. He saw his father's eyes narrow, the predatory instinct of a man who destroyed what he couldn't control. "You speak of debt?" Lucius stood, his presence looming over the table like a shadow. "You are here because we allow it. You are here to serve. Draco, show this woman the respect she deserves for her services. Remind her of her station." Draco's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment of betrayal. If he stood up for her now, the wedding would be cancelled, the assets frozen, and his mother would be out on the street. If he stayed silent, he would lose the only part of his soul that was still alive. He looked at Hermione, begging her with his eyes to back down, to be the professional, to survive. But Hermione wasn't looking for survival. She was looking for him. "Draco," Pansy prompted, her voice a poisonous purr. Tell her what you told me, that she's just a tool, a clever little mudblood who knows how to arrange flowers." The word felt like a physical blow to Draco's face. He felt the cold wash over him. He looked at his father's expectant sneer, at Pansy's triumphant smirk, and then at Hermione's trembling lip. She was vulnerable now, the golden girl stripped bare by the people he was supposed to call family. "She is..." Draco started, his voice cracking. He looked down at the table, unable to meet her gaze. "She is the best at what she does. That is why she was hired. Her background is irrelevant to the function." It was a middle ground, a cowardly, safe, grey middle ground. But to Hermione, it was a knife in the dark. "Irrelevant," she whispered, the word carrying more weight than Lucius's shout. She stood up, her chair screeching against the marble. "I see. Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Malfoy." She gathered her scrolls with shaking hands. The tasting is over. I believe the menu is settled. If you'll excuse me, I have a station to return to." "Hermione, wait!" Draco started to rise, but Lucius's hand clamped down on his shoulder like a vice. "Sit down, Draco," his father commanded. "You have a wedding to finish." Draco watched her go, her silhouette disappearing into the gloom of the hallway. He felt a profound sense of doubt settle into his marrow. He had protected his mother, his name, his future, and in doing so, he had confirmed her worst fears. He was a Malfoy. He was a coward. And he had just let the woman he loved walk out of his life, thinking she was nothing more than a footnote in his pedigree. The seesaw had hit the ground with a sickening thud. As the door clicked shut behind her, the dining room felt colder than it ever had during the war. Draco looked at the pheasant on his plate, at the expensive wine in his glass, and realized it all tasted like ash. Am I really in love with a mudblood? The question was no longer a whisper. It was a scream in his mind. Yes, he thought, the truth finally breaking through the ice. And I just destroyed her to save a life I don't even want. The tension in the room remained, thick and suffocating. Pansy was talking about centerpieces again, her voice a grating hum, but Draco wasn't listening. He was thinking of the way Hermione had looked at him in the forest, the trust, the warmth, the hope. He had traded that for a seat at a table of ghosts. He stayed in that chair for hours after they left, the candles burning down to stubs, the shadows creeping closer. He knew he had to call it off. He knew he had to find a way to break the contract without destroying his mother. But as he stared at the silver Malfoy crest on the napkin, he realized the internal conflict was no longer about her blood. It was about his own. He had to decide if he was a man or a Malfoy, because he couldn't be both. The chapter closed on the image of Draco alone in the dark, his hand reaching for the quill Hermione had left behind. He needed to know what was next, but for the first time in his life, the script wasn't written for him. He would have to write it himself, or die in the silence of the manor. The clock on the wall of Hermione's Diagon Alley office ticked with the rhythmic precision of a heartbeat, each second a sharp reminder of the time she no longer had. The wedding was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks until Draco Malfoy became the property of a lineage that despised her very existence. She sat hunched over her desk, the glow of a single enchanted lamp illuminating a sea of floor plans and floral invoices. Her eyes burned, but she refused to sleep. Sleep brought dreams of silver-grey eyes and the smell of rain in a dark forest, and she couldn't afford the luxury of heartbreak. A soft, muffled thump at the window made her jump. She reached for her wand, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she approached the glass. Outside, the London fog was thick, but leaning against the brickwork, his pale face ghostly in the moonlight, was Draco. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored robes. He looked dishevelled, his coat unbuttoned, his hair windswept and damp. She opened the window, the cold night air rushing in. "What are you doing here, Malfoy? It's 2 a.m. If your father knew you were wandering the streets of the magical district." "My father is currently dreaming of gold and pure blood," Draco interrupted, his voice a hoarse rasp. He didn't wait for an invitation. He climbed over the sill with a clumsy desperation that was entirely un-Malfoy-like. He stood in the centre of her small, crowded office, looking like a titan trapped in a dollhouse. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in that house another minute. "The tool is busy, Draco," Hermione said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay cold. She turned back to her desk, her hands shuffling papers she had already memorized. "If you're here to apologize for the dining room, don't bother. We both know you did what was expected. You played your part perfectly." "I hated every second of it," he shouted, the sound echoing in the quiet office. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing her wrist, not with aggression, but with a terrifying, pleading strength. "I saw your face when I said those words. I felt like I was casting a Cruciatus on myself. I am a coward, Hermione. I've told you that, but don't you dare think I meant a word of it." "It doesn't matter if you meant it," she cried, spinning to face him, her eyes finally welling with the tears she had held back for days. "The result is the same. You stand there and you let them humiliate me, and then you come here in the dark where it's safe and tell me you're sorry. That's not love, Draco. That's a haunting." The emotional seesaw was at its peak. The repulsion of his betrayal was fighting the warmth of his presence. He looked at her, and for the first time, the morally grey mask was gone. He looked broken, a man who had reached the end of his tether. "I'm calling it off," he whispered. Hermione froze. "What?" "The wedding. I'm sabotaging the contracts. I've already contacted the goblins at Gringotts to shift the Malfoy Trust into a blind vault that my father can't touch without my signature. A signature I won't give. I'm burning the bridges, Hermione. All of them." He stepped closer, his breath warm against her forehead. The slow burn was no longer a simmer. It was a wildfire. "I spent the last 3 nights looking at the guest list, and the only name that mattered was the one that wasn't supposed to be there. I can't marry her. I can't live a life where you are a service I hire. I want you at the table, not the ones serving it." "You'll lose everything," she said, her voice a mere breath. "Your name, your manor, your mother's standing, they'll cast you out." "Let them," Draco said, his voice gaining a sudden fierce clarity. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, a touch so light it felt like a dream. "I'd rather be a nobody with you than a Malfoy with her. I've spent my whole life being a Malfoy, and look where it got me. I was a child with a mark on my arm and a hole in my heart. You filled it, Hermione. You, with your infuriating logic and your ink-stained fingers." He looked down at her lips, the tension between them becoming a physical weight. The internal conflict was still there, the fear of the fallout, the weight of the war, but the can't help but think had won. "Am I really in love with a mudblood?" he asked, his voice soft, echoing the title that had haunted him. He let the word hang in the air, but this time it had no power. It was a relic of a dead language. He leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. "No, I'm just in love with you, and I think I've been dying of it for years." Hermione's heart soared and shattered all at once. She saw the internal guilt in his eyes, the way he was waiting for her to reject him, to tell him it was too late. She saw the man he was trying to become, the one who would stand in the light, even if it burned him. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the soft silk of his hair, pulling him down. But just as their lips were about to meet, the sound of a distant, booming bell rang out, the Ministry's midnight alarm for unauthorized apparition in Diagon Alley. Draco pulled back, his eyes wide. My father. He's noticed I'm gone. He'll have put a tracking charm on my signet ring. You have to go, Hermione said, the betrayal/doubt flickering back. If they find you here, let them find me, Draco growled, but he saw the fear in her eyes. He knew that if he was caught now, Lucius would use every ounce of his remaining influence to destroy her business, or worse. He couldn't risk her safety for a moment of selfish relief. He moved back toward the window, but before he climbed out, he took her hand and pressed a hard, desperate kiss to her knuckles. Meet me tomorrow, the White Tomb at Hogwarts. It's the only place they can't track me easily. If I'm going to do this, I need to know you'll be there when the smoke clears. I'll be there, she promised, her voice steady. He vanished into the fog, a silver ghost retreating into the night. Hermione stood by the open window, the cold air biting at her skin, but her heart was a furnace. The seesaw had swung toward trust once more, but the stakes were now higher than a wedding. They were playing for their lives, for their reputations, and for a love that had been forged in the very fires meant to consume it. She looked down at her desk, at the floor plan of the Malfoy ballroom. With a flick of her wand, she set the parchment ablaze. The orange flames licked the air, turning the wedding of the century into ash. She didn't need to plan a wedding anymore. She needed to plan a revolution. The chapter ended with a scent of smoke and the echoing promise of the White Tomb. The slow burn was reaching its climax, and the girl who once had no place in the Malfoy world was now the only world Draco Malfoy had left. The grounds of Hogwarts were draped in a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. The great lake was a sheet of black glass, reflecting a moon that looked sharp enough to cut. Hermione stood by the White Tomb, the marble cold against her palms. This was a place of endings, of Dumbledore, of the war, of the childhood they had both lost. She pulled her cloak tighter around her, the wind whipping off the water with a wintry bite. She was early, her anxiety a hummingbird trapped in her chest, fluttering against her ribs until she felt bruised from the inside out. A shadow detached itself from the forbidden forest. Draco approached with a gait that was no longer arrogant, but weary. The walk of a man carrying the weight of a crumbling empire on his shoulders. He didn't speak as he reached the tomb. He simply stopped a foot away from her, the moonlight carving deep hollows beneath his cheekbones. The internal conflict was etched into his every feature. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck, only to realize the shore was on fire. I did it, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I broke the Gringotts seal. I've liquidated the assets my father intended for the Parkinson dowry. By tomorrow morning, the Malfoy name will be synonymous with bankruptcy. My mother is already at her sister's estate in France. I sent her through a private portkey an hour ago. Hermione stepped toward him, her heart aching at the sheer magnitude of his sacrifice. Draco, you've lost everything. Your history, your home. I haven't lost anything I wanted to keep, he countered, finally looking at her. The warmth in his eyes was a flicker of hope in the darkness. The manor was a cage. The name was a shackle. For the first time in 24 years, I don't feel like a piece on someone else's board. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the Malfoy signet ring, the heavy silver band that had been the symbol of his burden. With a flick of his wrist, He tossed it into the black depths of the lake. A small splash, and then the silence returned. The ring is gone. The contract is void. The emotional seesaw tilted toward a terrifying trust. Hermione reached out, her fingers brushing the lapel of his coat. What happens when the sun rises? Your father will come for you. Pansy's family will demand blood. Let them come, Draco said, his voice hardening with a resolve he had never shown in their school years. They can take the gold and the stone, but they can't take the air in my lungs, and they can't take the fact that I'm standing here, with you, of my own free will. He leaned in, his hands coming up to cup her face. His skin was freezing, but his touch was electric. The non-verbal intimacy was suffocating in its intensity. The way his thumbs traced the line of her cheek, the way his breath hitched as he looked at her mouth. This was the man who had been emotionally broken, now trying to knit himself back together, using the only light he had ever known. I used to think you were the enemy, Hermione, he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. I used to think that if I could just hate you enough, the world would make sense. But the more I hated, the more I saw you. And the more I saw you, the more I hated myself for being exactly what they told me to be. You aren't that boy anymore, she whispered, her hands sliding up to rest on his chest, feeling the wild, erratic thrum of his heart. You're the man who walked away. The tension between them was a physical chord, vibrating with years of unsaid apologies and repressed longing. The slow burn was at its absolute limit. He was so close she could taste the peppermint on his breath, see the individual lashes of his grey eyes. She wanted him to kiss her. She craved the final shift from enemies to lovers. But the betrayal/doubt of the world outside still loomed. The wedding is in 12 hours, she reminded him, her voice trembling. They expect a groom. They'll find an empty suit, Draco said. I'm not going back. I'm staying here, in the only place that ever felt like it could be ours. But the peace was a lie. The air suddenly rippled, a violent distortion of magic that made the hairs on Hermione's neck stand up. A silver Patronus, a sleek, predatory hound, burst through the trees, its voice Lucius Malfoy's cold, echoing sneer. The boy thinks he can hide in the shadow of a dead man. I have the girl's office, Draco. I have her staff. If you are not at the altar by noon, Diagon Alley will burn, and she will be the one holding the torch. Choose carefully. A Malfoy pays his debts, or everyone he loves pays them for him. The Patronus dissolved into mist, leaving a trail of ice in its wake. The repulsion was instantaneous. Draco recoiled as if he had been slapped, his face draining of what little colour it had. The internal guilt returned with a vengeance. He had tried to be brave, but his father had struck at the only thing Draco couldn't sacrifice, Hermione's safety. He'll do it, Draco breathed, his eyes wide with horror. He'll destroy everything you've built. He'll frame you for the embezzlement I committed. No, Hermione said, her voice sharp with defiance. We won't let him. We'll go to the Ministry. The Ministry is in his pocket, Hermione. You know that. Draco grabbed her shoulders, his grip desperate. I can't let him hurt you. I thought I could run, but he's a monster that feeds on the people I try to protect. The seesaw plunged. The warmth of the moment was swallowed by a bitter, biting cold. Draco looked at her with an expression of such profound agony that it felt like a physical wound. He was going to go back. He was going to put the mask back on. "I have to go," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I have to stand at that altar. If I don't, you lose everything. I won't be the reason you're destroyed." "Draco, don't do this. Don't give him what he wants," Hermione cried, reaching for him, but he was already stepping back into the shadows. "I'm sorry," he rasped. "I'm so sorry. I thought I could be more than a coward, but for you, I'll be the best coward they've ever seen." He disappeared into the darkness of the forest, the sound of his apparition a crack like a gunshot in the silent night. Hermione was left alone at the White Tomb, the marble no longer just cold, but frozen. The internal conflict had reached its peak. He had chosen her by leaving her, and she was left with the ashes of a revolution that hadn't even started. She looked at the black water of the lake, where the Malfoy ring now rested in the silt. She felt the vulnerability he had mentioned earlier, the crushing weight of being golden in a world that only valued lead. But as she stood there, a sudden, fierce intelligence flared in her mind. She was Hermione Granger. She was the architect of legacies. And if Draco Malfoy was going to walk to the gallows to save her, she was damn well going to make sure the gallows didn't have a flaw. The chapter ended with Hermione turning away from the tomb, her eyes burning with a new, dangerous purpose. She needed to know what was next, but she already knew one thing. She wasn't going to watch him marry Pansy Parkinson. She was going to finish the wedding her way. The morning of the wedding arrived with a cruel, mocking brilliance. The Wiltshire sun pierced through the conservatory glass of Malfoy Manor, turning the 10,000 floating candles into shimmering droplets of fire. The air was thick with the scent of white roses and the heavy metallic undertone of ancient wards. This was the grandest stage ever built, a masterpiece of artifice and duty. Draco stood before a tall gilded mirror in the groom's antechamber, his hands trembling as he adjusted the high collar of his traditional black dress robes. He looked like a man being prepared for burial. "You look like a Malfoy," his father's voice drifted from the doorway. Lucius stood there, his cane clicking against the floor, a smirk of cold triumph on his face. "The assets have been stabilized. The Parkinson alliance is secure. You've done what was necessary, Draco. The girl has been spared, provided you don't falter at the final step." Draco didn't look at him. He looked at the empty space on his left hand where the signet ring should have been. He had covered the absence with a glamour, a lie built upon a lie. "I know my debt, father," he said, his voice as hollow as a tomb. "Get out." The ceremony was a blur of emerald and silver. As Draco walked down the aisle toward the floral dais, the seesaw had hit its lowest point. He felt the repulsion of every guest's gaze, the internal guilt of his return, and the crushing cold of a life without Hermione. He reached the altar and turned. Pansy was approaching, a vision of lace and sharp ambition, her face hidden behind a veil of enchanted gossamer. But then he saw her. Hermione stood at the back of the hall, near the grand doors. She wasn't wearing the black robes of a planner. She was wearing a gown of soft, shimmering gold that caught every spark of candlelight. She didn't look like a servant or a tool. She looked like the sun. Her eyes met his across the sea of pure-blood aristocrats, and in that look there was no pity, only a challenge. The wizarding priest began the incantation. We gather here to bind the blood of Malfoy and Parkinson. Draco's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. He looked at Pansy, then back at Hermione. She raised her hand, and for a second he thought she was waving goodbye. But then he saw the flicker of her wand, hidden in the folds of her dress. A sudden, violent tremor shook the manor. The eternal luminescence candles flared into a blinding white heat. The internal conflict in Draco's chest snapped. He realized Hermione hadn't come to watch him fail. She had come to give him the opening he was too afraid to take. "Draco Lucius Malfoy," the priest intoned, the air crackling with the magic of the binding. "Do you take this woman to be the keeper of your name and blood?" The silence that followed was a physical weight. Lucius leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Pansy waited, her hand outstretched. Draco looked at Hermione one last time. He saw her mouth a single word: live. "No," Draco said. The word was quiet, but in the magically amplified hall it rang like a thunderclap. "I'm sorry," the priest stammered. "I said no," Draco repeated, his voice gaining a fierce, intoxicating strength. He stepped back from the dais, ripping the glamour from his hand to reveal the bare skin where the Malfoy ring should have been. "I will not bind my blood to a lie. I will not spend the rest of my life as a ghost in a house of shadows." "Draco!" Lucius roared, standing up, his wand clearing his sleeve. "Think of what you are doing." "I am thinking for the first time in my life," Draco shouted back, his eyes fixed on Hermione as she began to walk down the aisle toward him, the crowd parting in shock. "The gold is gone, Father. The vaults are empty. There is no dowry. There is only a man who is finished with your war." Pansy let out a shriek of outrage, but Draco was already moving. He leapt from the dais, his robes billowing, and met Hermione halfway. The enemies to lovers transition was complete. The enemies were the people in the chairs, and the lovers were the two outcasts standing in the center of the storm. "You came," he whispered, his hands finding hers. "I told you I'd be there when the smoke cleared," she replied, her eyes bright with tears and triumph. "The ministry is outside, Draco. I filed the paperwork this morning. Your father's threats are on record. He can't touch you. He can't touch us." Lucius raised his wand, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. You mudblood bitch. You've destroyed..." But before he could finish the curse, Draco stepped in front of Hermione, his own wand level and steady. "Touch her, and I will burn this manor to the ground with us inside it. Walk away, Father. Your era is over." The tension was a live wire, a slow burn that had finally exploded into a revolution. For a long, breathless minute, the world hung in the balance. Then, seeing the ministry auras flooding through the doors, Lucius Malfoy slumped. The predator was gone. There was only a tired, broken old man left in the ruins of his pride. Draco turned back to Hermione. The silence in the room was now theirs. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they tucked a stray wild curl behind her ear. The non-verbal intimacy was no longer a secret. It was a public declaration. He looked at her with a raw, emotionally broken honesty that made the guests gasp. "I have nothing left to give you," he murmured, the vulnerability finally laid bare. "No name, no fortune, just me. That's all I ever wanted," she whispered. He didn't wait for another word. He leaned down, his mouth finally finding hers. The kiss was not the polite, staged peck of a pure-blood wedding. It was a collision of years of longing, of "can't help but think," of can't stand it, and finally, can't live without it. It tasted of salt, of desperation, and of the first real breath he had ever taken. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers, his eyes closed. "Am I really in love with a mudblood?" he whispered against her lips, the word now a badge of honor, a joke between souls. "Shut up, Malfoy," she breathed, a small, radiant smile breaking through her tears. She pulled him back down, and this time the kiss was deeper, slower, a happy ending written in the middle of a battlefield. They turned and walked out of the manor together, hand in hand, leaving the candles to burn out and the ghosts to fade. Behind them, the wedding of the century lay in pieces, but ahead of them, the sun was rising over a world where blood was just blood, and love was the only magic that mattered. As they stepped out into the fresh morning air, Draco felt the weight of the world lift. He wasn't a Malfoy anymore. He was just Draco. And beside him, the woman who had saved him was no longer his enemy, or his planner, or a golden girl. She was his home. The silence of the Cornish coast was not like the silence of Malfoy Manor. In the manor, the quiet was heavy, a suffocating shroud woven from the judgmental whispers of portraits and the weight of centuries. Here, in the small, weathered cottage perched precariously on a jagged cliff, the silence was alive. It breathed with the rhythm of the Atlantic, the low, guttural roar of the waves against the stones, and the persistent, whistling sigh of the wind through the gaps in the window frames. Draco stood by the small kitchen table, staring at a loaf of bread as if it were a complex, dark artifact. He was dressed in a simple, oversized sweater that Hermione had knitted for him, wool that was slightly scratchy and smelled of lavender and wood smoke. He looked at his hands. They were pale, as always, but they were no longer the hands of a prince. They were the hands of a man who had spent the morning trying to dig a small vegetable patch in the salty, stubborn soil of the garden. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of doubt. The adrenaline of the wedding, the fire, the defiance, the dramatic exit had long since faded. In its place was a cold, creeping uncertainty. He watched Hermione through the doorway. She was curled up in a worn armchair by the hearth, a book in her lap, her face illuminated by the soft, flickering orange light of a dying fire. She looked perfectly at home. She looked like she belonged in this humble, drafty space. And he felt like an intruder in his own life. "You're thinking too loud again," Hermione said softly, not looking up from her page. "I'm not thinking," Draco lied, his voice sounding raspy even to his own ears. "I'm contemplating the structural integrity of this bread. It's remarkably dense." Hermione finally looked up, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She set the book aside and stood, her movements fluid and unburdened. As she walked toward him, the non-verbal intimacy between them intensified. The space in the small kitchen seemed to shrink, the air thickening with a slow burn that had become the baseline of their existence. She stopped in front of him, reaching out to brush a smudge of dirt from his cheek. Her touch was warm, a grounding wire for his racing heart. "It's okay to be scared, Draco. You've spent your whole life being a Malfoy, learning how to be just. Draco takes time." "Is just Draco enough for you, Hermione?" he asked, the vulnerability finally cracking through his aristocratic mask. He caught her hand, holding it against his face. "I have no influence." I have no vault. I'm a man who can't even bake a loaf of bread without looking like he's lost a duel. I see you here, thriving, and I wonder, when will you realize that you traded a dragon for a lizard? The seesaw swung toward a painful, raw honesty. Hermione didn't laugh. She stepped closer, her chest brushing his, her eyes searching his with a fierce, uncompromising heat. I didn't choose you for your vault, Draco. I chose you because you were the only person in that house who actually saw me. I chose you because you were brave enough to be a coward for me. And if you ever call yourself a lizard again, I'll be forced to hex you. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. The scent of her, the sandalwood, the parchment, the sea salt, was the only thing that kept his lungs moving. Draco felt the internal conflict begin to soften. He wasn't the Prince of Slytherin anymore, and the world didn't care about his bloodline. For the first time, he was being loved for the parts of him that were broken, not the parts that were polished. But the doubt wasn't easily banished. That evening, a ministry owl arrived, its feathers ruffled by the sea spray. It carried a heavy official scroll. Draco opened it with trembling fingers. It was the final decree. The Malfoy assets were officially forfeited to the War Reparations Fund. The manor was to be sold at auction. The signet ring he had thrown into the lake was now legally as well as physically gone. He sat at the small wooden desk, the parchment curling under the weight of his hand. He was officially a nobody. "Draco?" Hermione asked from the doorway, her voice laced with concern. "It's over," he said, his voice flat. "Everything they said I was, it's gone. I'm just a name on a piece of paper now." He felt the repulsion of his past identity, the shame of what the Malfoy name had represented, clashing with the warmth of the woman standing before him. He expected her to say something practical, something about the ministry's laws or the fairness of reparations. Instead, she walked over and took the parchment from his hand, tossing it onto the fire. "Good," she said, watching the edges of the decree turn to black ash. "Now, there's room for something else." She turned back to him, her eyes glowing in the firelight. She reached out and took his hand, tracing the lines of his palm with her thumb. "The anatomy of silence isn't about what's missing, Draco. It's about what we choose to fill it with. Tonight, we fill it with this." She pulled him toward her, her mouth finding his in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly real. There were no ghosts in this kiss. There were no Mudblood slurs, no Lucius, no Pansy. There was only the taste of her, the heat of the hearth, and the distant, rhythmic roar of the ocean. The tension shifted from fear to a deep, grounded desire. Draco wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into him, his fingers tangling in the wild curls he had once pretended to despise. He felt her heart beating against his, a steady, frantic rhythm that matched his own. As they moved toward the small bedroom, the floorboards creaking under their weight, Draco realized that the silence wasn't a void. It was a canvas. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to pick up the brush. The chapter ended with the sound of the wind howling outside the cottage, a storm brewing over the Atlantic. But inside, by the dying embers of the fire, the slow burn had finally reached a steady, glowing warmth. He needed to know what was next, not because he was afraid of the future, but because for the first time he was the one writing it. The return to Malfoy Manor was not a choice, but a necessity. A week later, a summons arrived from the Gringotts goblins. A single, private vault, one Draco didn't even know existed, required his physical presence to be cleared before the estate was officially handed over to the Ministry. "You don't have to go," Hermione said, her hand resting on his arm as they stood at the edge of the manor's wards. The iron gates were rusted. The silver peacocks that once patrolled the grounds now looked ragged and neglected. "I have to," Draco said, his voice steady. "I have to leave it behind properly. I can't live in a cottage and dream of a museum." They walked up the long gravel drive in a tense, heavy silence. The atmosphere was oppressive. The manor looked like a dying beast, its windows like sightless eyes. As they entered the great hall, the dust motes danced in the dim light. The portraits were empty. The ancestors had fled to other estates, leaving only the gilded, hollow frames behind. "It's smaller than I remember," Hermione whispered, her eyes scanning the ballroom where they had stood just weeks ago. "Everything looks smaller when you're not afraid of it," Draco replied. They moved toward the library, but as they passed the drawing room, Hermione stopped. Her breath hitched and her hand tightened on her wand. Draco felt the repulsion instantly. This was the room where his aunt had carved a lie into her skin, the room where he had stood and done nothing. The ghosts of the past seemed to materialize in the shadows. He could almost hear the screaming, almost see the flash of green light. He looked at Hermione. She was staring at the floor, her face pale, her eyes wide with a trauma that time hadn't yet touched. "Hermione, look at me," Draco said, stepping into her line of sight, blocking the view of the floor. He took her arm, the one that carried the scar. He peeled back the sleeve of her gold-trimmed robe, revealing the faded, jagged letters. The internal guilt burned in his throat like fire. He didn't offer a dry apology. He didn't talk about the war. He knelt on the cold marble floor. He took her hand in his and slowly, reverently pressed his lips to the scar. The non-verbal intimacy of the gesture was profound. Hermione let out a shuddering breath, her fingers curling into his hair. The room, which had been a place of horror, was suddenly filled with a quiet, sacred reclamation. He was kissing the wound he had allowed to happen, and in doing so, he was finally asking for the one thing he didn't think he deserved: her forgiveness. "The ghosts don't live here anymore," he whispered against her skin. "They only live in the silence we don't speak into." Hermione pulled him up, her eyes wet with tears. "Then let's finish this, Draco. Let's leave this house to the dead." They found the vault key in the library, hidden behind a false shelf. It wasn't gold or jewels inside. It was a collection of letters from his mother. Letters she had written to him during the war, never sent, full of her own fears and her secret hopes that he would one day find a way out. As they walked out of the manor for the last time, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the lawn. Draco didn't look back. He took Hermione's hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, and together they stepped through the gates. The happy ending wasn't a grand palace or a restored name. It was the feeling of her hand in his, the taste of the salt air waiting for them in Cornwall, and the knowledge that the only thing a Malfoy owed the world was the truth. The story of the wedding was over. The story of their life was just beginning. A year had passed since the great hall of Malfoy Manor had been emptied of its ghosts, and the world outside the Cornish cottage had begun to forget the scandal of the wedding that wasn't. For Draco and Hermione, however, time had taken on a different texture, less like a ticking clock and more like the slow, rhythmic turning of the tide. The cottage, once a drafty refuge, was now a home. The garden that had once been a patch of stubborn salt earth was now a riot of magical and mundane flora. Dirigible plums bobbing alongside rosemary and sea lavender. It was the anniversary of their escape. Draco stood on the small wooden deck overlooking the Atlantic, the spray of the evening sea dampening his linen shirt. He was no longer the sharp-edged, brittle boy who had haunted the library of the manor. His face had filled out, the hollows under his eyes replaced by the faint, fine lines of a man who spent his days in the sun and his nights in peace. In his hand, he held a small velvet box, not of Malfoy silver, but of simple, dark wood he had carved himself. Inside the cottage, the soft, warm glow of candlelight spilled through the open windows. Hermione was humming a tune he didn't recognize, a muggle melody that had become the soundtrack to their quiet mornings. She was the architect of this life as much as she had been the architect of his redemption. The wine is chilled, Draco. Unless you're planning on becoming a permanent fixture of the coastline, I suggest you come inside. Her voice drifted out, laced with that familiar, bossy affection that still made his heart skip. He stepped into the warmth of the kitchen. The table was set for two, simple ceramic plates, a bottle of white wine from a vineyard in France that had no ties to his father, and a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked that afternoon. Hermione was standing by the stove, her curls a wild, untamed halo in the firelight. She turned as he entered, and the tension between them, now a sweet, resonant vibration, pulled them together instinctively. "You're wearing that look again," she said, wiping her hands on her apron and stepping into his space. "What look is that?" "The one where you wonder if you've accidentally died and gone to a very specific, coastal version of heaven." Draco laughed, a low, genuine sound that vibrated in his chest. He reached out, his hands settling on her waist, pulling her flush against him. The non-verbal intimacy was effortless now. They knew the map of each other's bodies by heart. "I'm just marveling at the fact that I survived a year with the brightest, most stubborn witch of her age without being turned into a ferret." "The night is young," she teased, her arms winding around his neck. They ate in a comfortable, companionable silence, the kind of silence that only comes when two people have run out of secrets. They talked about her new project, a legal clinic for house elf rights, and his work with the herbology department at Hogwarts, providing rare coastal ingredients for advanced potions. They were no longer the prince and the Mudblood. They were partners. As the moon rose, casting a silver path across the dark water of the bay, Draco led her out to the garden. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and blooming jasmine. He felt the internal conflict one last time, not the fear of her rejection, but the overwhelming weight of his own gratitude. He had been a man who deserved nothing, and she had given him the world. "Hermione," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register that made her stop. She turned, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Draco." He didn't drop to one knee. He didn't want the theatrics of his past life. Instead, he took both of her hands in his, feeling the small calluses from her books and her garden. For years, I lived in a house where love was a contract and loyalty was a threat, he began, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. I thought my name was my only value. I thought my blood was my only legacy. But this year, in this small, drafty house, I've learned that the only legacy worth having is the one you build with your own hands. And the only name I want to be associated with is yours. He pulled the wooden box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a ring, but not one of gold or emeralds. It was a band of dark, polished ironwood, inlaid with a thin thread of braided silver, the same silver from the dress she had worn the day he chose her. I can't offer you a manor. I can't offer you a seat in the Wizengamot. I can only offer you a man who will spend every day of the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the light you brought into the dark. He looked her directly in the eyes, the final shift from his old self to his new one complete. Will you marry me, Hermione? Not for a name, and not for a legacy, just for us. Hermione's breath hitched. The slow burn that had started in a cold drawing room years ago finally reached its zenith. She didn't look at the ring. She looked at him, seeing the morally grey boy finally stepped fully into the light. Tears blurred her vision as she let out a small, choked laugh. You took your time, Malfoy, she whispered. I wanted to be sure I wasn't dreaming, he replied. You're not dreaming. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the ring. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and the moment it settled, the magic of their shared intent seemed to ripple through the garden, making the dirigible plums glow a soft, radiant gold. Draco pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was the ultimate resolution. It was a kiss that contained the memory of the rain in the forest of Dean, the heat of the library, the defiance of the wedding altar, and the peace of the Cornish coast. It was a kiss of equals. As they stood in the garden, the Atlantic roaring below them, and the stars witnessing their vow, the title that had once been a slur and a question, "Am I really in love with a mudblood?" was finally and forever laid to rest. There was no mudblood. There was no pure blood. There was only Hermione and Draco, two souls who had found the courage to burn down the old world so they could build a new one in the ashes. The happy ending wasn't a destination. It was the quiet, steady breath they took together as they walked back into their cottage, leaving the door open to the sea breeze. The ghosts were gone. The debt was paid. And for the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy was exactly where he was meant to be. The story of the magical wedding planner and the disgraced groom ended not with a grand ceremony, but with a simple, shared life, a legacy of light, a history of love, and a silence that was no longer empty, but full of everything they had chosen to be. The ironwood ring on Hermione's finger felt heavier than any gold, a grounded weight that tethered her to a reality she had once thought impossible. The morning after their private vow, the Cornish fog rolled in thick and white, swallowing the cliffside and turning their cottage into a solitary island in a sea of mist. Inside, the hearth crackled with dry driftwood, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. Draco sat at the small kitchen table, not with a ledger of debts or a seating chart, but with a simple piece of parchment and a quill. He was writing to his mother, a real letter, one stripped of the coded language of pure-blood etiquette. Hermione watched him from the doorway, a mug of steaming tea cradled in her hands. The non-verbal intimacy between them had reached a point of absolute fluency. She knew by the slight tension in his shoulders that he was struggling with how to describe their happiness without sounding like he was gloating to a woman still trapped in the old ways. "Tell her about the garden," Hermione suggested softly, crossing the room to stand behind him. She rested her chin on his shoulder, the scent of his skin, rain and clean wool, filling her senses. Tell her that things grow here because they want to, not because they're forced. Draco leaned back into her touch, his head resting against her chest. "She won't understand the concept of a garden without a house elf to prune it, Hermione. But I'll tell her. I'll tell her that, for the first time, I'm not waiting for someone to tell me I've done well. I already know." He turned in his chair, pulling her into the space between his knees. The slow burn had evolved into a steady, deep-seated warmth, but the tension was never truly gone. It had simply transformed into a magnetic pull that made every touch feel significant. He traced the rim of her tea mug, his fingers brushing hers. "I've been thinking about the firm," he said, his gaze dropping to the ironwood ring on her hand. "Gold and Griffin. You've spent the last year rebuilding other people's lives while we hid here. It's time you went back to London. Not as a planner hiding a scandal, but as the woman who broke the Malfoy curse." Hermione felt a flicker of the old, internal conflict. London meant the profit. It meant the whispers in Diagon Alley. It meant seeing Pansy's cold smirk or the pitying looks from the Sacred 28. "I'm not sure I'm ready to share you with them yet," she admitted, her voice dropping. "Here, you're just mine. There, you're the Malfoy who walked away. I'll always be just yours," Draco promised, his voice a low, fierce vow. He stood up, taking the mug from her hands and setting it on the table. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her with a protective strength that made the rest of the world feel like a distant memory. "But we didn't do all that fighting just to stay in hiding. You deserve to walk down Diagon Alley with your head held high, and I deserve to be the man on your arm who doesn't give a damn what they whisper." The seesaw shifted toward a final resolute trust. They spent the rest of the day preparing, not for a wedding, but for a debut. Hermione realized that their happy ending wasn't just about the cottage. It was about the freedom to move through the world without apology. When they finally arrived in London a week later, the city felt different. The air was charged with the energy of a ministry election, and the gossip of the wedding of the century had been replaced by newer, fresher scandals. Yet, as they stepped onto the cobbles of Diagon Alley, a hush fell over the crowd. Draco didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his mask of cold indifference. He simply adjusted his grip on Hermione's hand, his fingers interlaced with hers, and walked toward the Golden Griffin offices. They encountered Pansy Parkinson outside the apothecary. She looked as sharp and polished as ever, but there was a hollow bitterness in her eyes that even the finest French silk couldn't hide. She stopped, her gaze dropping to their joined hands, then to the simple ironwood ring on Hermione's finger. "Draco," she said, her voice like a thin blade. "I see you've fully embraced your new station. I heard you were living in a shack by the sea. I didn't believe it until now." Draco stopped, but he didn't let go of Hermione. He looked at Pansy, and for the first time there was no repulsion or guilt in his eyes. There was only pity. "It's a cottage, Pansy, and it has more life in its kitchen than the manor had in its entire east wing," he said calmly. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. But if you're looking for the man who was supposed to marry you, he died the day he met the woman beside me." Pansy's lip curled, but before she could utter a single slur, Hermione stepped forward. She didn't use her wand. She didn't use her intellect as a weapon. She simply looked Pansy in the eye with a quiet, devastating dignity. "The wedding would have been beautiful, Pansy," Hermione said softly, "but it would have been a cage for both of you. I hope one day you're brave enough to break your own." They walked past her, leaving the silent crowd behind. The internal monologue in Draco's head, the one that had once asked, "Am I really in love with a mudblood?" was finally silenced by a roar of pride. He wasn't just in love with her, he was honored by her. The final scene of their return took place in the very ballroom of Malfoy Manor, which was being prepared for its first public auction. The ministry had allowed them 1 hour to do a final sweep. The room was stripped of its emerald silks and its 10,000 candles. It was just a room of stone and cold echoes. Draco led Hermione to the center of the floor, the exact spot where he had once stood in his wedding robes, and said, "No." "One last thing," he whispered. He pulled a small enchanted music box from his pocket, a muggle device he had modified with a bit of delicate charms work. He set it on the dusty floor and activated it. A soft piano melody began to fill the vast space, a stark contrast to the heavy orchestral music that usually played here. He held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Granger? No audience, no contracts, no expectations." Hermione laughed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She stepped into his arms, and they began to move. They weren't perfect. They stumbled over the uneven floorboards, and the music was a bit tinny in the large hall, but it was the most beautiful dance of their lives. As they swirled in the center of the empty ballroom, the slow burn reached its final eternal glow. The tension was gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. Draco pressed a kiss to her temple, his eyes closing as he breathed in the scent of her hair. "I love you," he whispered. "I know," she replied, pulling him closer. The story of the Malfoy and the Granger ended, not with a grand announcement or a public feast, but with a dance in the ruins of their past. They were two people who had looked into the darkest parts of themselves and each other, and chosen to stay. As they walked out of the manor for the very last time, the doors groaned shut behind them, sealing away the ghosts. They stepped out into the London sun, two souls forged in fire, tempered by rain, and bound by a love that had proven itself stronger than blood. The happy ending wasn't a fairy tale. It was a choice they made every single day. And as they disappeared into the bustling crowd of Diagon Alley, hand in hand, the world finally looked exactly as it should. Bright, messy, and full of infinite possibilities.
Hello everyone, thank you for staying with this story until the end. For me, this was not just about magic or wands, it was about change. We often think we are trapped by our past. We think we must be who our family wants us to be. Draco was a man with a cold heart and a dark name. Hermione was a woman with a strong mind and a brave soul. Together they learned something important. They learned that love is more powerful than blood. It is not easy to walk away from a golden cage. It is scary to lose everything you know. But Draco found that losing his money was the only way to find himself, and Hermione found that her greatest strength was not her magic, but her heart. I hope this story reminded you of one thing. It is never too late to choose a different path. It is never too late to choose love over hate. Thank you for listening. Believe in your own magic. Goodbye.